Did you ever walk through the hall at school when the other children were in their rooms? Did you ever listen to the sounds that come from the rooms? Some rooms sound like this. What's happening inside?
And joining me on the program is teacher and author Lewis Buzbee to discuss his book, Blackboard, A Personal History of the Classroom. Lewis Buzbee looks back over a lifetime of experiences in schools and classrooms, from kindergarten to college and beyond. And you'll hear him say on the program that schools saved his life. We look back on education's past, examine its present, and wonder about its future. I think you guys will enjoy this conversation with myself and Lewis Buzbee. Let's dive right in. Blackboard, a personal history of the classroom. Tell me, Lewis, what is Blackboard all about, and what inspired you to write this book?
Well, Blackboard is really a book that focuses on school, but I think in a different way. I wanted to focus on what actually happens in the classroom between teachers and students. It seems to me that so many of our public debates these days are bureaucratic debates. What's the curriculum going to be coming down from those on high? What's the way the school is going to be organized? What's the pedagogy, et cetera? And I wanted to go back and spend a lot of time in the classroom and see what actually happens there in the classroom. And so I spent a lot of time delving into my own memory, looking at the classrooms that I had grown up in as a child in San Jose, California, looking at the classrooms around me that my daughter's been in for the last 13 years, and also the classrooms that I've visited around the country as a writer of books for children. So I really wanted to focus on what really happens, where the work is actually done.
According to your book, you said schools practically saved your life in a very personal way. I want to read this part of your book here. You said, after the sudden death of my father when I was in junior high school, my life, both in school and out of it, took decidedly troubled turns. And there were several years when I was on the verge of slipping through the cracks, of not living up to my potential. I can only imagine how thin my life would have been, how limited my choices if I had continued on that path. My schools, their teachers, administrators, and the very structures those schools offered steered me to a course that made it possible for me to rescue myself. Yes, school saved my life. That's very powerful.
Actually did save my life. Not in a movie version sort of way, not in a Dead Poets Society or To Serve with Love sort of way, but in a rather average way. I was growing up in elementary school and the beginning of junior high school, a truly average student. I came from working class parents. My father left school when he was in 8th grade. My mom graduated high school. No one in my family had ever been to college. So we weren't like an academically inclined family that way. And I was an average student. I was, smart enough kid, personable enough. I talked in class, but, I had a lot of television to watch and a lot of bicycles to ride. And then when my father died, I really did sort of go out of control a little bit. He died at the end of my 7th grade year. And I began by 8th grade and 9th grade, I was taking drugs, I was stealing things, I got arrested. I was really out of control. I don't want to blame it all on my father's death. Certainly that had something to do with it. And partly it was I was just sort of a stupid teenage boy, which is pretty common. So there was no one real big crisis, but what happened in my high school, this is the early 1970s, the teachers that I had there were dedicated enough, respected enough, and had enough time and enough space in their day to give me that extra attention that I really required. They knew what I was going through. They kept pushing me personally. They kept pushing me academically. And eventually, by the end of my sophomore year, because of those teachers, because of the space and time they had in those classrooms, I was able to pull my head out of the sand and suddenly discovered a newfound love for learning that would eventually carry me on to college and after that. And when I think about that sort of fork in the road there for my life, it's really astonishing that it was school and the teachers there who saved my life. Again, these were really engaged teachers. This is the early 70s, so it's still a time of high idealism. We still respected teachers as a society and what they contributed. And they never came down on me really hard. They offered me small things, a half an hour after class, to talk about a problem that I was having, whether it was a school problem or a life problem, giving me the right books at the right time. And I had never been a reader before. And suddenly one of my teachers had an inclination that, you might like this. And I read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, and my head blew off, and I began reading and reading. And then when I wrote my first stories, I would take the stories to them, and they would spend their own time, read them, and bring me in and talk to me about them. I had one French teacher for 4 years, Sal Galbraith, all during high school, and that friendship, which was friendship on my part and mentorship on her part, that mentoring that she gave me through the subjunctive case in French, through imperfect verbs, and through just the trials of being a teenager, that mentoring that she gave me set me on a road that, in a classroom that had 40 kids in it, with a teacher who was woefully underpaid and highly overworked, as so many public school teachers are today, I would have gotten lost in that classroom. And I can look back now and see my life is so much better because of that.
Definitely a reminder to our teaching audience that you do make a difference. It's not just about standardized testing and all the stuff we've got going on today. Another excerpt that you wrote in your book. Between 1962 and 1975, when I was a public school student in grades K through 12, California schools were invariably ranked number one in the nation by all measures. Today, the state's public schools are regularly ranked 48th or 49th. What happened?
Well, what really happened was in California, was in 1979, Howard Jarvis passed what we now call Proposition 13, which cut back property taxes a great deal, a huge deal, and most of that money was taken out of public education. And from that time, and then continuing with the Reagan tax revolt of the 80s, when the American public as a whole decided, no, we don't need to put money into the public good. We're just going to keep our money for ourselves. Because of that, state funding for schools dropped precipitously. And that's what brought us to the situation that we have here in California today, which is not unlike the situation in other states. The way I see it, it's basically a lack of the public's will to spend money on taxes for the greater good of public education. And it's really disturbing because in every political race, every campaign, you will hear every candidate say education is one of their top priorities. And then when it comes time to actually be in office, they do very little about it. That's what's really shocking to me. And when I first started writing Blackboard, and I went to visit my old elementary school, Bagby Elementary in San Jose, I was really surprised one day, and this was a weekend, to show up and find a bake sale in progress. And they were making some money, a couple of $100 selling cookies and brownies, to try and raise money for paper, pens and pencils, art supplies, the basic needs of an elementary school classroom. And I've seen that bake sale everywhere around the country that I've gone to. You see everywhere on their websites where teachers can go to and say, please help fund my classroom this year. At the beginning of every year, teacher friends of mine post things about how they've just gone to the school supply store and maxed out their credit cards with their own money to supply their schools. And it seems to me that the whole public discourse is all about the huge bureaucratic issues of schooling and is not concerned at all with what happens in the classroom.
Was that always the case?
I don't think it's always been the case. I think we have a sense that in post-war America, at least, and even before that, the creation of good, clear, solid education for all was a benefit to the society, was a benefit to each individual that really transcended sort of individual greed. And I think that's what's really most disturbing to me.
What about parenting, looking back at school's history and what it is today?
It's a tricky issue because when you have involved, engaged parents helping out their children and then helping out in the school, that's always a wonderful thing. But we also know that in a lot of cases, because of economic conditions, because of cultural conditions, some parents are not going to be involved. And we know that a lot of students arrive in our schools hungry, sort of unengaged because of their family life. And I think another thing that really struck me about studying the classroom this way is how much a refuge from that pallid home life school can be for some students. I think that parents being involved is absolutely top priority, but I don't think we can count on our parents to save the education of our children. That happens in school, and that's why we send our kids to school.
Is there a connection between parent involvement today and the amount of money that gets sent to schools as far as tax money?
I find a real disconnect there. I find parents, everywhere you go, you find parents saying, we want better schools, we want better schools. And yet, no politician will come out and say, I'm going to raise your taxes so we can make better schools, until we vote for those politicians who say, I'm going to keep your taxes low. So there's a real disconnect there. And what's happened out of that is we end up blaming, I see everywhere I go, people blaming the teachers when the teachers are, again, underpaid, overworked, and really not respected members of society. And that is a sort of a slippery slope. Because of those factors, the underpaid, the overworked, and the lack of respect, you have people entering the teacher workforce who then don't stick around. They come in with high ideals. Something like 43% of all teachers who enter the profession, the K through 12 teaching, will leave after 5 years. And, I've been a teacher myself. I teach college, I teach adults, but I also know that it takes, 5-10 years before you're getting really good at it. So we're not raising up cadre of teachers that we really need.
In your book, I'll quote this, I'm fortunate, I know, as a kids book author, to be invited into schools, both public and private, rich and poor. I wish that every parent, maybe every adult, could spend a day at school now and then, an entire and regular day, to see the excitement that happens in the most basic classroom, the hunger of children to learn. Expand on that for me.
I think that one of the reasons I would love to have parents and just citizens, regardless of whether they have children, have them spend a day in a classroom is to remind them that this day that a child spends in a classroom is a very long, very crowded day for that child. And to really remind the adult of what it's like to spend time where learning actually happens, to see what's actually required. I also think it would be a great idea to go to a classroom that's not your child's classroom. When you go to your child's classroom, you're worried about, is my child getting enough attention? Really just to spend some time in a classroom and remember that this is the place that it happens and that everything else around it, the pedagogy, the curriculum, the bureaucracy, all of that is external to the real work at hand, which is one teacher standing in front of a group of, I'd like to be 15 or 16 children, and trying to engage them in the world and push them out into the world.
Can you share some stories with our audience about what you've seen in your travels to different classrooms?
The many positives I've seen when I've been invited in as a writer of kids' book is finding that teacher who is incredibly prepared, incredibly engaged with each of the students, knows each of the students, and makes that classroom a completely dynamic place. Just another reminder that, this is where it happens. And I have to say, I've seen those teachers in the most expensive and prestigious private schools. I've seen those teachers in the most hard-scrabbled public schools. When it comes down to it, it's going to be that teacher in that classroom. And then, the other thing that we really forget, as much as our children complain about, I got to go to school again today, blah, blah, blah. We all complain about going to school at some point. The thing about that is that when you get in the classroom and you have an engaged teacher, those students are so anxious to learn. There's so much having a good time while they're working. You know, the classroom itself hasn't changed. It's a very simple device. When you put the right teacher in there, boom, it just explodes.
Let's take a look into the future of the classroom.
I hope that the classroom in the future looks very much like the classroom of the past. Sure, we're going to be using more technology. That's just a given. But looking back through illustrations and histories of classrooms, and I'm talking 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago, they really haven't changed very much. I said earlier when we were talking that the classroom is a really simple device. My prediction is that there's probably going to be a lot more technology in classrooms. My hope would be, and this would be my biggest hope, would be there would be fewer students in each classroom and more teachers in each classroom as well. You know, why don't we have older teachers mentoring younger teachers in the same classroom so that students and teachers can find that space and that time in the classroom? That would be my hope for the class.
A lot of discouraged teachers out there. Anything that you can say that can help motivate them to continue doing what they're doing?
Because the work you do is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial to who we are as human beings. I mean, in the beginning of the book, I describe education as a fundamental human right, and I think we need to get back to that notion. Education isn't about necessarily job training. It's not about providing the tech force of tomorrow with good middle-class jobs. It's about human life. It's about exposing the student to the world, making them curious and engaged and anxious to go out into the world and change it. Remember that when you talk to that one kid about that one aspect of their life, you're making a huge difference. And that is going to ripple out to the rest of our world.